Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Green Alliance webinar on how to reach zero carbon power in the UK by 2035. My name is Stuart Dossett. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance, sitting in our Low Carbon Futures team. Helena Bennett was going to chair today, but unfortunately she's unwell, so I'm stepping in to double hat, both as your chair and as one of our panel of experts. Joining me are two colleagues, Liam Hardy, who's a policy analyst who's been looking into all of the scenarios for how we can decarbonise the power sector, and Flossie Boyd, who's one of our political advisors working on the energy bill. So the UK is committed to reaching a zero carbon power system by 2035. Achieving this is crucial to the UK reaching net zero, but what does a zero carbon power system look like? Using new Green Alliance analysis of 30 power system projections, our expert panel today will discuss how the three building blocks fit together to form a zero carbon power system. We'll also discuss where we think the current government policy is insufficient to meet the 2035 target and what should change. And then we'll link this to the Energy Security Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, and explore options for improvements that could catapult us forward to 2035. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand over to Liam Hardy to talk us through the analysis.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and hello to everybody here. Just going to share my screen now, which I hope you can see. So I'll just skip past the holding slide really and get cracking. So the work that we've been doing is to have a look at and analyze 30 different scenarios from 7 different studies that have looked at what the electricity system in the UK might look like in the year 2035 or 2030 in the case of one of the studies. And what we've done is we've extracted all of the kind of key numbers to be able to compare them to each other and see where there's agreement and disagreement as well. We did take a couple of scenarios out of our final analysis because they kind of weren't deemed ambitious enough, shall we say, to be zero carbon. They still had some significant residual emissions in the system. But there wasn't necessarily anything specifically different about those. They just, as I say, weren't necessarily ambitious enough. So the point here really is that what we've done is analysed the really heavy-duty modelling done by all the smart people at some of these organisations. So we feel pretty confident, and hopefully you'll feel pretty confident, that if these scenarios were to materialise, if these technologies were built, then we would have certainly a secure supply throughout the year. So one of the main messages from this analysis is that all of the scenarios agree that we are going to need something that looks like these 3 building blocks in our zero carbon power system. The first is really quite a large amount of renewable power. That's what we're calling block number 1. And that will be providing the majority of the energy generated. But to make sure that we've got that security of supply, we also will need another block, which we're describing as a clean dispatchable power or energy, which we're calling block 2. And also this third block, which is not actually generating new fresh energy itself, but might be moving it around or storing it for different times, which is that interconnectors and storage block. So different studies and scenarios have different sort of sizes of each of these blocks, and I'll show the chart for that in a moment. But just to kind of clarify what I mean by clean dispatchable energy, that's something that's providing a kind of firm or baseload power supply, or a flexible power supply as well, which is obviously very useful when you might have extended periods of low wind generation or low solar generation. So that's helping to balance on a day-to-day timescale, but also longer sort of seasonal as well. And just to say, and I'll show you this in the next slide, but currently that dispatchable / baseload power supply is coming from mostly not clean sources of energy, so fossil fuels, with a couple of clean ones as well. So here's the first chart to show you. This demonstrates, on the left you can see kind of where we are now in terms of capacity, and when I'm talking about capacity, by that I mean the maximum power output that the system can provide, or these technologies can provide. But just to clarify, that's not to say we'll ever be in a situation where we need everything everywhere all at once, so that even the peak demand is never quite as high as that total capacity. So you'll see that in 2020, we've got a big chunk that's of our capacity, which comes from unabated fossil fuels, a fair amount already from renewables. But looking ahead to 2035, we've got a couple of different scenarios from the study shown there to show sort of the diversity, but clearly we will need to build a lot more renewables, and as well as these other two blocks, the clean dispatchable and the interconnectors and storage. It's worth saying that even sort of the largest amount of clean dispatchable power that these scenarios are predicting will be needed is of the same order as what we currently have in our dispatchable fleet, which is again mostly provided by fossil fuels, but also there's a bit of nuclear in there and bioenergy as well. There's just one other thing I'll say, that there's a little simplification here in that some of these scenarios do include still some unabated fossil fuels in what we're calling that clean dispatchable block 2, but often they're neutralized by some negative emissions technologies like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which I'll touch on in a minute. Next slide, just to give you a little bit more of a breakdown of what's in those different blocks, building blocks. So what you'll see is that there's pretty wide agreement that we need a huge amount of renewables. That's the more green colors there on the chart between these different studies. Different sizes of the dispatchable block, and then again different sizes of that storage and interconnectors as well, which is the blue and gray at the top. Just to note that the study from the Climate Change Committee and the 6th Carbon Budget, the data they provide doesn't include data on capacity, so I haven't shown that in this chart, but when we get to generation in a minute, we'll see that. Okay, so the next thing is generation, I think. So yeah, here we go. So just to clarify again, by generation, we mean the total amount of electricity or power that is supplied, and that can be different to the capacity because some things will be running more often or less often. So you'll notice as well that I haven't included block 3 in this chart, which is the storage and interconnectors, and that's because they're not actually generating new energy, as I said before, they're just moving it around or storing it. So they're not shown here. But again, the main point here is that renewables are likely to be providing 70 to 90% of all the electricity that we use in 2035. So we definitely need more of them, and there's kind of no regrets in building those out because we're certainly going to need more. Again, I think I got a chart here just to break that down a bit more in terms of some of the different technologies. Again, you've got large amounts of offshore wind in particular, some onshore wind, solar, and then others. And it's worth noting that, as I said, there is a small amount of unabated fossil fuel generation in some of these scenarios, which is neutralized by that negative, those negative emissions from bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. But those like dark brown wedges here are much smaller in generation than they were in capacity. If I skip back a couple of slides, we might have quite a lot of legacy capacity, which might be kept on the system for emergencies, but hopefully not used very much, if at all. All right. So where are we? Oh yeah, just a little bit of drilling down in some of those what we've called clean dispatchable technologies. So that's block 2 in our system, just to give you a bit of a sense of what's in there. Shown here in orange is nuclear, fossil fuels with CCS, so gas with CCS is in yellow, hydrogen turbines in kind of a dark pink, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage in the light pink, bioenergy without carbon capture and storage in the kind of orangey brown, and then, as I say, a little bit of fossil fuels maybe still on the system for emergencies in dark brown. one of the points here is it might be possible to run this system without all of those different technologies in the mix, just a few of them, or most of them, or all of them. But it's impossible to predict right now, and we might well need all of them, especially if some of them don't work out because they haven't all been deployed at scale yet. I won't go into too much detail on the trade-offs of these because we might touch on that in the Q&A, but there are trade-offs and risks, so it's interesting if we want to discuss that. And then I'll just mention the other piece of what's missing, which is the energy storage. Again, not expecting you to read through all of this, but the main point is there's a bunch of different energy storage technologies out there. We will really need lots of energy storage, and there's different types that are good at different things. They're at different levels of research, development, and deployment. But one of the key things is what we will need is some long duration energy storage, which means something that can supply electricity over a long period. And kind of classic lithium-ion batteries are not particularly good at that because they start to get expensive when you want to store large amounts of energy. So looking for other technologies to be in the mix there, like popular ideas at the moment are things like redox flow batteries and hydrogen, energy stored as hydrogen as well. Again, we can touch more on that if we want to in the Q&A, but I'll finish by saying these are the kinds of things that we really need to see happen to reach this zero carbon power by 2035. So we definitely need to build loads and loads of renewables, and in order to make those work, we will need to scale up some of the ability to move that energy around with the grid. As I say, it's certainly no regrets to be doing that because we know we'll definitely need more. And the other piece is that how do we scale up some of those new technologies that aren't yet deployed at scale that can provide our clean dispatchable power and our energy storage as well. So I think that's it for me. I will stop talking. Thanks. And back to you, Stuart.
Great, thank you, Liam. Should have said at the outset, but please do pop any questions that you have into the Q&A and we'll pick those up once we've been through the presentations. It's Flossie and I still to come. So now we have a good idea of what the 3 blocks of a future energy system will look like. We can turn to the question of what policies do we need to get that system built? Now, Liam showed us that renewables will form the bulk of the future power system, and the main policy that will make this happen is already well developed. It's the now annual contracts for difference auctions. But there are still areas for improvement. Green Alliance has been calling for a clean power plan that sets out a roadmap for turning the ambitious renewables targets into actual delivery. And in his net zero review, Chris Skidmore has seen the need for something similar, calling for the creation of a government task force and deployment roadmaps this year to ensure that the UK reaches its target of 70 gigawatts of installed solar capacity and an increased deployment of onshore wind. But what about blocks 2 and 3, that clean dispatchable power and that energy storage and interconnection? So some technology bespoke measures already exist or may soon exist. So we've got the Energy Security Bill, for example, planning to introduce business models for hydrogen and carbon capture usage and storage funded by a levy on consumer bills. We also have the cap and floor mechanism that's being used to support the development of new interconnectors. But can a broader mechanism help to facilitate the development and deployment of a range of new technologies that may form parts of block 2 and block 3? Now this, for us, is where the capacity market comes in. It's a ready-made mechanism that already supports the development of new energy infrastructure through the award of up to 15-year contracts. But too much of that money is still being directed towards unabated gas power stations, locking that infrastructure into the grid for the long term in a manner inconsistent with achieving a decarbonised power system by 2035. In the most recent capacity market for auction, for example, 15-year contracts were awarded to 6 gigawatts of new build unabated gas. Now, the government has recognised this inconsistency between the capacity market and a net zero power system, and is currently consulting on aligning the capacity market with net zero by requiring unabated gas generation to meet lower emissions limits from October 2034. But rather than having this a gentle glide path to reducing emissions within the capacity market, what this proposal does is create a late in the day cliff edge for retrofitting unabated gas power plants for use with either hydrogen or carbon capture. And crucially, the proposed capacity market changes do nothing in the near term to incentivize the purchase of new forms of clean power. So this is why Green Alliance is calling for reform of the capacity market to make sure that it purchases a rising share of zero carbon power consistent with achieving a decarbonised power system by 2035. And while it's all well and good getting the policy in place to deliver the capacity that we'll need across blocks 1, 2, and 3, it's of no use if we don't have a grid that can support it. So there's been recent examples of the grid not keeping pace with developments, be it the 10-year wait times for renewable projects to connect into the grid, or housing developments in West London boroughs that are being postponed because of capacity constraints. So the energy security strategy highlighted the need for Ofgem to expedite its approvals process, to facilitate anticipatory investment in the grid, and to speed up grid connection times. But Ofgem is limited in its remit to achieve this. So updating its remit to incorporate the government's net zero target as set out in the 2008 Climate Change Act is a first and critical step to achieving this. But long-term planning is also needed, including Ofgem working with the network companies to facilitate anticipatory investment and the delivery of the holistic network design for offshore wind. So I've set out some of the challenges here and a few of the potential policy solutions for bringing a zero carbon power system into reality. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Flossie, who'll talk to you about the Energy Security Bill and how we can use it to achieve some of these aims.
Hi everyone, and thanks Stuart and Liam for a really interesting analysis. Just to kind of contextualize the briefing a tiny bit, as everyone will be all too aware, we're living through a series of pretty devastating crises with the energy security crisis and huge hike in global gas prices brought on by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The bills crisis we've seen as a result, with over 9 million people living in, frankly, Dickensian conditions in cold, damp homes this winter, and of course the climate crisis. And all of these crises have something in common, and that is the need for more domestic cheap power on the grid and efficiency measures to reduce demand, which means that getting to 2035 with a zero carbon energy system, as this briefing sets out, has really wide significance beyond just meeting our carbon budgets. So I wanted to just give a bit of context about what Green Alliance are doing to push the government on this, given the pertinence of the issue. We have launched alongside Uplift, Warm this winter, which is a huge coalition of over 40 leading charities, which for the first time brings anti-poverty and climate groups together. And the coalition have come together around the joint aim to support people struggling with energy bills this winter and for every winter after, by calling the government to provide a coherent plan to move to a clean power system and away from fossil fuels. And thanks for this analysis for usefully setting out how this needs to happen. In terms of what the government are doing and what needs to happen and the work we're doing to push on this, we've definitely successfully seen the narrative change and the link between high energy bills and the need for cheap renewables and energy efficiency measures has very much become present in the political discourse in relation to the cost of energy and benefits to consumers of decarbonising in a way that it wasn't before. And as a result, we've seen things like the windfall tax on excess profits of oil and gas companies, which, as we've probably all seen today's headlines, is not quite enough. Energy efficiency task force has been set up, and there's been the introduction of a demand reduction target by 15% by 2030. And we've obviously got a great track record on offshore wind, and even a glimmer of hope through the levelling up bill last year that onshore wind could be unblocked, but it looks like that could be a bit of an ongoing struggle. But we still need to go a lot further, both with fiscal and non-fiscal measures, including through legislative change, which brings me on to the Energy Security Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament and is a big focus of our campaign. And given the infrequency of such bills, the Energy Bill provides a really vital opportunity for the UK to make sure that we get to 2035 with a clean and secure power sector, and make sure that people are warm this winter and every winter, and we're not so we can build up resilience to future price shocks. So what are we hoping to achieve with the Energy Bill? Our kind of the key outcomes we're looking for are for the Energy Bill to facilitate capacity market reform, as Stuart mentioned, to push off those last remaining fossil fuels off the system. We also want to use it to reduce demand through energy efficiency measures, given that energy efficiency can help to decarbonise by reducing the overall size of the system that we're going to have to build. But it's also an immediate, unproven measure that can be taken to reduce people's energy bills right now. And additionally, we want the bill, obviously, to get renewables onto the grid faster than they're going on there right now. And also, as Stuart set out, the grid is a big blocker for that. So we want the bill to enable faster build out of grid through changing the remit of Ofgem. All government departments have been given net zero duties in line with the Climate Change Act, but Ofgem, as an energy regulator, have not, which is mind-boggling. So that's a bit of a summary of the context of the analysis in the Energy Bill crisis and the convening work that Green Alliance are doing to push government where pushing is needed. And with that, I will pass back to Stuart.
Great, thank you, Flossie. I think we're going to move into the Q&A section now. So if Liam, you could also pop in your camera as well so we can see you up on the page. Excellent. Thank you all to the questions you've put in already. Please do keep adding them as we go through. We'll be monitoring that, and do use the upvote buttons if there's a question you see in there that you particularly want us to answer. Now, I am technically a part of the panel today, but having stepped in for Helena to chair as well, I do have the liberty of directing the more tricky questions to either Liam or Flossie, so make sure you get those in as well. Maybe we can start off then, Liam. I'm going to come to you. Could you talk us through some of the pros and cons of the different technologies in the clean dispatchable block? And maybe just, I saw there was a question in the chat about what do we mean by dispatchable, so maybe you could just start by answering that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me, I'll actually just pull up my slides again because I've got a slide on this which might help. So let's see. Yeah, so very quickly, I just typed out an answer for that question, but by dispatchable, essentially, I think that means being able to turn on and off when we want, rather than when the sun is out and when the wind is blowing, for example. So it's something that you have ultimate control over, turning on, off, or ramping up and down. And some people will have noted that we've included nuclear in that list. Most of the nuclear in the UK at the moment isn't considered particularly dispatchable. It's pretty much on at all times. It's cheaper and more efficient to do it that way. But it is definitely possible to turn nuclear on and off, and some of these scenarios do explicitly mention that they are expecting nuclear to have to be a little bit more responsive to matching supply and demand. And of course, we know that that goes on a lot over the channel in France, where most of their grid is nuclear powered, and they need to be able to turn it up and down at different times. But just to answer your first question, Stuart, there are lots of different trade-offs and risks. Obviously, there are political ones in terms of some of these technologies being more or less popular with citizens, but there's definitely technological and kind of climate risks as well, which I'll just very briefly highlight. That a couple of these technologies are relying on carbon capture and storage, which is still yet to be kind of tested and proven at scale in the UK. It could work and it should work, and we hope it will work, but there is that risk that it doesn't, and that leaves us in a sticky situation if that happens. And equally, this reliance on negative technologies and negative emissions technologies like BECCS to balance out those small amounts of unabated fossil generation that we might have, obviously a risk, and there are obviously also wider environmental risks of using or overusing biomass as a source of energy. The other thing that's actually kind of, I think, not on everybody's radar at the moment, but it really ought to be, and I hope people are starting to pay attention, is recent research by Environmental Defence Fund have shown that the climate risks and climate impacts of leaked hydrogen are worse than we first thought, and we also know that hydrogen is especially leaky and difficult to contain. So there is that risk that if we kind of put too much emphasis and too much reliance on hydrogen, and we don't do a good job of containing those leaks, that can also have climate impacts as well. So that's sort of the baseline. I'll just mention that there are other technologies that maybe have less of these risks, but they might have other challenges as well. So people often talk about things like enhanced geothermal and more tidal and marine power as well. Those also have trade-offs, and they're less technologically advanced in general. So yeah, there's no silver bullet, sadly, but we're probably going to need at least several of these different technologies, and we obviously need to be working hard to make sure they work.
Great, thank you, Liam. Maybe we could stay with you for a moment, actually, and just to what extent is energy efficiency in the home and demand side response a factor within the modelling that we looked at?
Yes, absolutely. Most of these different studies and scenarios do definitely include kind of wider energy efficiency measures to reduce total demand, but also those responsive measures that can what's called shift the peak, or shift the time or the scale at which we get the peak demand. So classically, that's kind of 5 p.m. on a weekday when we all get home and put the kettle on or start cooking dinner or whatever it is. But certainly that's going to be very important at shifting that peak demand and reducing the peak capacity that we need to be able to supply. It's quite difficult to quantify, though, and I think many of these studies have talked about it. Some of them have quantified it a little bit, but they haven't all done so, and so we haven't kind of compared that across the board. But yeah, absolutely critical part of the system, the future system, and obviously lots of exciting work going on there as well, but still more to be done, more to be ironed out.
Great, thank you. Staying with energy efficiency, Flossie, maybe I can come to you at this point. And energy efficiency has become a bit of a politically tricky topic with multiple failed attempts at national insulation schemes. Do you think there's hope that this government will stick their neck out with the ambition that's needed?
Thanks, Stuart. Well, I think the narrative has definitely changed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I mean, as I mentioned, there's been a new task force and demand reduction target set out. And so I think based on words, everything seems quite positive, and that there is much more ambition. But based on the actual policy change and funding that's needed, it's not the level of ambition that we need to be seeing. For example, it's completely missing from the energy bill. There's nothing on energy efficiency at the moment. But there's lots of momentum on this across the sector, and it's the same with power decarb. And it's worth noting that across amendments tabled in all of our priority areas, including capacity market reform and Ofgem, we've had support from peers from across all parties, as well as positive engagement from MPs of all parties. So we're hopeful that the government will see this and hear this and budge. And there's also, we've heard a lot that it's a big priority for government at the moment. So I think, yes, there's hope given the narrative shift and kind of murmurings we're hearing from government. But having been barely talking about insulation to now talking about it quite a lot, it's definitely not translated into this wartime effort that the Environmental Audit Committee have called for. So I think it's an uphill struggle, but there's reason to be hopeful for sure.
That's good to hear. And staying with the energy security bill, see there's a question in the chat that's been getting a few upvotes, which is around, apart from changing the remit of Ofgem, what are the other key changes that we need to see in the energy security bill?
So as Stuart mentioned, the other kind of key bits for power sector decarb is the capacity market reform, which Stuart, you could maybe talk a little bit more about if you wanted to, and then I could go on, be a bit more specific about what we're calling for with energy efficiency following that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so with the capacity market reform, what we're calling for is for the government to amend the capacity market so that it starts directing money that's currently going into long-term contracts for unabated fossil fuel generation into these new forms of zero carbon, dispatchable, and the energy storage sector that Liam talked us through at the beginning. So the blocks 2 and 3 in this model that we've put together. And we want to see this having an increasing rising share of the capacity procured through the market over time, such that by the time we hit 2035, we have a fully decarbonised system that's supported by a fully decarbonised capacity market. I think one of the other things that is worth mentioning, because I think this is getting a reasonable amount of focus, it's not one of the priority areas in the bill for Green Alliance, is the levy that will be placed onto consumer bills to facilitate the business model for hydrogen and carbon capture usage and storage, which is proving contentious, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's definitely nervousness about a hydrogen levy going on to consumer bills at a time when people are struggling so much. So there's quite a lot of activity in the sector campaigning around that. But on energy efficiency, our key ask is on the private rented sector, because there's already minimum energy standards in legislation for private renters for landlords, but they're currently at EPC-E. And the energy bill, we're specifically focusing on this because it's so essential for tackling fuel poverty. Private renters are much more likely to be fuel poor than any other tenure. About a quarter of renters are living in fuel poverty at the moment, which is just staggering. And they're also the most likely to live in leaky homes. And given that energy efficiency is the best way to bring down bills, but landlords have little incentive to invest in it, we're calling for that regulation to change and bring private rented sector up to EPC-C. And analysis by E3G has predicted that this would save renters on average nearly £600 a year, as well as help the government meet its targets on demand reduction. And I think importantly, the reason we're going for private rented sector is because it's targeting the able to pay group in society and people with much more access to capital. Whereas with owner occupiers, there are barriers and risks which are larger. And importantly, there's already a regulatory mechanism in place. Yeah, so those are our kind of key priorities under power sector decarb, and including energy efficiency. And I think we're trying to be as focused and targeted because we think that these changes could have a huge, huge impact.
Thank you. So having focused on the home for a moment with energy efficiency, I'm going to bring us onto the driveway. And the question sitting with the most upvotes at the moment is whether any of the roadmaps considered the potential effects of vehicle-to-grid technologies. And it mentions that by 2035, there may be 10 million batteries parked on people's driveways inside their car. So I'll start answering this and then I'll hand over to Liam. But yes, absolutely. A number of the scenarios we've looked at have considered the potential use of vehicle-to-grid. So that's basically taking power out of the vehicle battery and providing it into the grid at times of peak demand. So CREDS is one in particular that's done did a big deep dive into vehicle to grid, but also the Imperial College London study had a large amount of battery modeling, but more focused on field to grid from a qualitative perspective. But I'm going to bring Liam in now to go into a bit more depth into the studies.
Thanks, Stu. Yeah, we didn't sort of pull this out as a particular quantitative aspect, but certainly most of the studies mention it, if not try to quantify it. And so it's kind of obvious in many ways, isn't it? There's going to be a load of batteries, as you say, sitting on people's driveways. It shouldn't be that challenging to incorporate them as part of that that need for large amounts of storage, energy storage, especially on those short timescales of hour-to-hour variation. So yeah, it's got to be part of the solution, I think, but it's a bit difficult to quantify it from the modeling that we've seen. I think some of Ember's studies have quantified it to an extent, but yeah, it's definitely there, and I know there are people working on it, so that's a good thing, and we do need to find ways to make that come to fruition as well.
Great, thank you. See, there's one question in the chat around, are there any credible scenarios that don't require an element of nuclear power? I'm going to brave stepping into the nuclear world here. The scenarios we've looked at, I think, all have an element of nuclear power within them. This is as much a reflection of the reality that there will be nuclear power systems in continued operation at that point, as opposed to any real discussion around whether nuclear power has to be an absolute core part of the energy mix or not. Having taken that one, I think the question with one of the most upvotes at the minute in an area we've not particularly touched on yet is the recognition of the importance of the role of grid infrastructure in meeting the targets and recognizing the need for connection reform and regulatory reform, for example, off-GEMS duties. The question notes that there's also need for planning reform to speed up decision-making, align planning and regulatory timeframes, and community benefit frameworks. So the questioner is then asking, what do we see as the biggest priority? Planning, again, always another contentious piece of the legislation. I think I'm going to take it slightly out of the grid to start with and focus on onshore wind. It's positive to see that there has been an increasing focus on onshore wind, particularly amongst parliamentary MPs, and that there has been a recognition that onshore wind has to be a part of the future energy mix. I do think there is further that we can go on this, and I'll bring Flossie in a moment as well for her views on this. But I think that the amendment that we're seeing in Parliament at the moment still leaves onshore wind in a special category of itself in terms of the planning regulation around its deployment. And what we really need to see is that special treatment of onshore wind being removed and just a standardization into the planning system of onshore wind so that it has to meet the same challenges that any other development might need to do. But Flossie, have you got further thoughts on onshore wind?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that there's definitely, again, using this word, narrative shift. there's been a shift on onshore wind, given that it was only 2015 that it got banned, and last year, just before Christmas, we saw in the Levelling Up bill a backbench rebellion of Tory MPs, which is over 30 Tory MPs, I think, calling for onshore wind to be, the ban on onshore wind to be removed. And I mean, I think in the last 5 years, about 20 turbines or something have been built in England, despite the need to massively ramp up renewables development. And yeah, as Stuart said, though, it looks like this rebellion hasn't actually led to that much real change. And I think the new rules would still require local authorities to kind of proactively set out where onshore wind can be built. And we know that this doesn't happen because only 11% of local authorities have done this, which is why we have so little onshore wind on the grid. So that's definitely still a priority for us and for the sector to keep pushing on.
Great. Now, not ducking the question by only talking about onshore wind when the question was really around the grid. I think the other priorities are really just getting that anticipatory investment happening. And the Skidmore review was really clear on the need for this to happen as well. It was quite a strong recommendation that the government and Ofgem need to work together with the network distributors to take a longer term view on the infrastructure that's going to be required and to approve the anticipatory investment for that. Recognizing that there may well end up with situations where some of the grid may not be fully utilized. But I think given the scale of the build that needs to happen and the speed at which it needs to happen at, so as not to slow down the overall progress towards a decarbonized system, there's a real role for that anticipatory investment. So for me, I think that's the biggest change. It needs to be that combination of government, Ofgem, and the network companies working together to speed up that process and allow for anticipatory investment to happen. Okay, turning back to the questions here, and we've had so many questions coming in, so thank you for these. It's really great to see such interest. We have a question here around whether we analyze the share of green versus blue hydrogen in the modeling scenarios. So Liam, maybe I'm going to come to you for this one. If you could let us know the extent to which the scenarios do touch on green versus blue, and then any other thoughts you have on this debate.
Of course, yeah. Again, I think there's a bit of variability across the different studies, and on average, most of them don't dig deep into this distinguishing between blue and green. But obviously, if you imagine the power system as a closed system, which obviously it isn't, but if it was the case that you went heavy on electrolyzers to turn excess renewable energy at times of overproduction into green hydrogen for storage, for long-term storage, and then long duration energy storage supplying back to the system. That kind of makes sense. There's a lot of logic in there. However, if you find that you need more of that clean dispatchable power from hydrogen than you're creating through your electrolyzers, you might be turning to things like blue hydrogen, which, just in case anyone isn't clear on the difference, green hydrogen comes from clean electricity splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, whereas blue hydrogen comes from fossil gas, natural gas, which is then split into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And then in theory, you capture that carbon dioxide and store it underground, and you've got cleanish hydrogen, but with risks involved as well. Lots of people have views on this. I've got personal views, but I think our general view at Green Alliance is obviously green hydrogen is better and safer from a climate perspective. It could be that it takes a bit longer than blue hydrogen to come to fruition and to commercial scale production. In the meantime, there's lots of things that we need to kind of ramp up their use of hydrogen. So not just in possibly clean dispatchable power or energy storage, but also in industry, and especially in, for example, in the chemicals industry. And so it might be that blue hydrogen plugs that gap in the near term, and we start to take over with green hydrogen in the long term. Certainly, of all the different types of carbon capture, my understanding is that carbon capture from hydrogen production is the easiest, because when you split fossil gas into hydrogen and carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide comes out fairly cleanly, and you don't need to scrub it and clean it and purify it further to then store it underground. So probably that makes sense in the short term, and then maybe not so much in the long term because of those risks and trade-offs. But yeah, I hope that helps.
Perfect, thank you. Now we're coming to the end of our time, so I think we'll sneak in one final question. I'm going to come to you again, Liam. So you may have thought you were done, but no such luck. We have a question here around whether we found a heavy reliance on so-called negative emissions technologies such as biomass with carbon capture usage and storage in the models. And it goes on to say, it seems unlikely that large-scale industrial biomass will be desirable from an environmental point of view, particularly on a global basis.
Yeah, I think it looks like a question from Dan there, and it definitely hits the nail on the head in terms of those risks and discomfort that's certainly very much there across the sector. There is variation in those different models. If people are particularly interested in a study that doesn't rely on those negative emissions technologies, then the Imperial College study that we used is very interesting, because it just deliberately says we're not going to include this in our modeling. We're going to see how things look without it, and focus much more on the energy storage and a bit of hydrogen to supply that balancing, play that balancing role. So it's, there are scenarios where it's not needed, but some of the more established scenarios, so for example from the Climate Change Committee and from the National Grid, do include some level of BECCS, and of the scale of the size of what is currently DRAX, but would if it had a carbon capture and storage on top as well. But again, really kind of tricky political space, lots of really valid concerns there, and also kind of like a political history that's challenging as well. So yeah, I think ultimately everybody would probably agree it would be great if we didn't need to rely on those negative emissions technologies, especially in the power sector, which we know we could get to very, very cleanly without needing it. But maybe in the short term, it helps to balance out those little bits of fossil fuels that we still use in emergency situations. And there are, of course, other industries which will be relying on these technologies more so, because they're even harder to fully decarbonize. So yeah, a tricky question, and I'm sorry I haven't given a great answer, but the Imperial study is the one to look at if you're interested in that.
Great, thank you, Liam. Thank you, Flossie. We've come to the end of the webinar here, and that feels like a nice place to end that reminder that a power system is not just a power system in isolation, and actually it needs considering in the broader context of the decarbonisation of the entirety of the UK. Thank you all for joining today. Hopefully you found this useful. We published much of what you saw in the presentation at the beginning in a recent briefing that we'll send around following on from this event today. Please do take a read, and please do keep an eye out for future Green Alliance webinars that will be coming soon. Have a good day.